The void is silent, but silence in the galaxy is never a mercy. When the Tyranids come, there is no thunder of banners, no oath-bound declaration of war, no heraldry carved into steel. There is only the slow drowning of light beneath an endless tide of living hunger, the shadow in the warp creeping ahead of them like a suffocating fog, choking every thought, every prayer, every desperate scream. Planets that once rang with the clang of manufactura and the chanting of priests are reduced to husks of bone and dust, their skies stripped clean of color, their oceans boiled away to nothing, their people either devoured or ground into nutrient pulp for the swarm. What does it mean to face such a thing? What does it mean to fight against a hunger that cannot be reasoned with, bargained with, or halted by any mortal will? To witness the death of a star system beneath the claws of the Great Devourer is to stare into the truth of the galaxy's fate itself. For where the Tyranids go, nothing remains. And yet, it is within this abyss that stories are born. Stories of regiments standing to the last man, of civilians buried alive in ruins they once called home, of psychers writhing as the shadow closes in and cuts them from the Emperor's light. These stories are fleeting, swallowed by the swarm, but for a moment they blaze with the fragile defiance of humanity. This is the tale we follow tonight, a descent into the heart of a Tyranid invasion, not through the gaze of omniscient historians, but through the eyes of those who endured it, those who lived long enough to die. Before we begin, take a moment to anchor yourself in this darkness with us. Like the Astronomicon guiding ships across the void, your support is the light that lets this channel endure. If you find yourself drawn into these tales, share them with others who walk the same dark road, and let your voice be added to the vox choir of those who keep this lore alive. Subscribe, so that when the next story is whispered, you are there to hear it before the echoes fade. Now we descend. The first sign was not the screaming of the sirens, nor the thunder of cannons being dragged into position on the bastions of Hive Mind. It was silence, not the ordinary hush of nightfall or the lull between shifts in the manufactura, but a silence that pressed down like a weight upon the chest, as though the air itself had thickened into glass. Astropaths felt it first, thrashing in their sanctums, blood pouring from their ears as their connection to the Astronomicon shuddered, then severed entirely. They had no words to explain the rupture, only cries and garbled fragments of warning before their minds collapsed inward, leaving them nothing more than twitching husks upon their thrones. To the rest of the Hive's teeming millions, the change came more subtly, a moment when conversation faltered mid-sentence, when laughter died in the throat, when even the endless pounding of manufactorum engines seemed muffled as though smothered under a shroud. The administratum clerks dismissed it at first as a localized phenomenon, a malfunction of vox, or an ill omen misinterpreted by the weak-minded. But when the silence stretched from hours into days, the truth became undeniable. Messages to the wider Imperium went unanswered. Navigators attempting to plot warp routes reported only blind void, a suffocating blindness in the currents where once the Emperor's light had blazed. Merchants who had hoped to ply trade between systems instead grounded their vessels in terror, unwilling to risk translation into a sea that no longer carried any beacon of salvation. The Hive's upper spires, so used to arrogance born of commerce and endless supply, saw their skies begin to darken with the smoke of hoarded promethium and the panic of nobles who realized their titles would not buy them safe passage beyond. What was to come? It began as whispers, then chants, the shadow in the warp, words carried on the lips of soldiers in barracks, of workers bent over assembly lines, of priests trembling before their altars. The enemy had not yet been seen, but already its presence suffused every corner of the system, seeping through stone, steel, and flesh alike. Mothers clutched their children tighter, sensing in some animal way the dread descending. The skies above Bellicane grew restless, a haze forming where once the stars glittered. Daylight dimmed into perpetual dusk. Clouds boiled unnaturally, moving against the winds, as though drawn by some colossal breath, inhaling from beyond the atmosphere itself. When the first spore ships entered orbit, there was no fanfare, no announcement from the Imperial Navy. Their forms appeared like cancerous growths against the void, blotting out starlight as they drifted closer. Vast living asteroids studded with tendrils and fleshy protrusions. Some screamed as they fell, not with sound but with psychic resonance that rattled the bones and tore at the soul. To the untrained eye they might have seemed inert, but those who knew, those who had studied the scattered reports of the Great Devourer, recognized the truth. The swarm had arrived. Panic took root swiftly. In the underhive, where the air was already poison and water scarce, riots broke out as families clawed for rations that no longer seemed guaranteed. Above them, the noble houses quarreled in their gilded spires, each one insisting they alone had the right to evacuation should the Navy muster transports. But evacuation was a dream. The Shadow had already severed communication beyond the system, and the Navy itself was fractured. Its fleet stretched thin along the sector line. Reinforcements would not come. In the grand basilicas of the ecclesiarchy, sermons turned shrill, priests shouting themselves hoarse in desperate attempts to hold their flocks together. Some called it a test of faith, others the Emperor's wrath made manifest. Yet beneath their proclamations lay fear so raw it could not be disguised. They knew the stories. Every world that faced the swarm ended the same, stripped, drained, and forgotten. Faith gave strength, yes, but faith alone did not halt claws that could rend Lehman Russ tanks apart or jaws that could chew through adamantium. Still, the people listened, because listening was all they could do. The silence broke at last, not with triumph, but with a sound so alien it shattered every illusion of safety. From beyond the stratosphere, the first mycetic spores began to fall, tearing streaks of fire through the dim skies. They were not bombs in the conventional sense, but vast living capsules, each one pregnant with horrors designed only to kill, consume, and spread. They punched into the ground with sickening impact, their shells splitting open as if birthing nightmares. From within, spilled creatures hunched and chittering, their forms gleaming with slick carapace, their scything limbs glistening with venom. They did not roar or announce themselves. They simply moved forward, an unbroken tide of hunger-given flesh. The defenders of Bellicane opened fire, lasguns lighting the darkened streets with snapping beams of red. Heavy bolters barked from the bastions, autocannons roared from chimera hulls, and the sky itself seemed to flash with muzzle fire. Dozens of creatures fell, shredded into ichor and bone fragments, but for each one slain, a dozen more surged forth from splitting spores. The ground itself became a battlefield of flesh and steel, of Imperial men and women fighting with desperate valor against an enemy that did not fear death, did not retreat, did not hesitate. The swarm pressed forward endlessly, not through strategy or cunning, but through sheer volume of life birthed only to die in the process of killing. The shadow in the warp deepened, vox lines screamed with static. Orders were lost in the noise, and regiments found themselves cut off from one another, fighting blind as the streets ran with blood, and the screams of the dying drowned even the thunder of the guns. Night fell fully, though no sun had truly set, and the hive became a labyrinth of flickering light and endless skittering shapes in the dark. Above it all, the sky continued to rain fire as more spores fell, each one a herald of a nightmare yet to be faced. The sky had darkened, and with it, hope itself began to wither. The first streets to fall were the avenues of the Manufactura, where endless chains of workers had once marched to the rhythm of sirens and overseers. Now, those same sirens wailed not to mark shifts but to scream alarm, blaring over the shriek of lasfire and the guttural hiss of creatures that had no name in the common tongue. Men and women who had never borne arms outside of riot suppression suddenly found themselves thrust into the firing line, handed battered lasguns or stub rifles older than their fathers, and told to hold the line until the guard arrived. Some obeyed with trembling resolve, standing shoulder to shoulder, their shots flickering red through the dusk. Others broke almost instantly, scattering into the labyrinth of tunnels, pursued not by men with whips but by claws that tore through flesh as though it were parchment. When the Astra Militarum did arrive, they came with the thunder of engines and the grinding tread of armored columns. Chimeras rumbled into position across choke points, their turrets belching fire, while lines of guardsmen took up firing ranks behind sandbag emplacements. Commissars bellowed litanies of duty, their bolt pistols drawn, promising death for cowards and absolution only in the Emperor's service. The air filled with the acrid stink of promethium as flamers roared, burning swathes of gaunts into ash. For a moment, for a heartbeat in the grand ledger of the battle, it seemed as though the Imperium could still hold. But the swarm does not relent, it does not grow weary. Where one brood fell in flaming heaps, another surged over their corpses, screeching and snapping, their alien eyes empty of fear. Warriors loomed behind the smaller beasts, towering synapse creatures that drove the tide forward with whiplash commands no human ear could hear. Bolter fire tore holes in their carapaces, grenades blasted chunks of ichor from their frames, but still they advanced. And wherever they stood, the lesser creatures followed with renewed frenzy, as though bound by invisible chains of thought that pulled them onward without pause. The defenders of Bellicane soon realized the truth that every world devoured by the swarm eventually learns. The fight is never truly against the claws and teeth alone, but against inevitability. Ammunition dwindled. Vox units shrieked and died in their operators' hands, sparks spraying across blood-stained armor. The shadow in the warp smothered all hope of psychic aid, cutting off astropaths and battle psychers alike. Even the sanctioned psychers conscripted into the guard fell silent, their eyes rolling back as they screamed and clutched their heads, the warp itself withdrawing like a suffocated lung. In their absence, fear spread unchecked. The hive itself groaned as the fighting tore deeper. Great promethium lines exploded in columns of flame, collapsing hab blocks into rubble. The air grew thick with smoke and the reek of charred meat, a stench so suffocating it coated every tongue and throat. Civilians stampeded through corridors, desperate to reach supposed safe zones that had already fallen. Children were trampled beneath the rush, their cries swallowed by the roar of detonations and the endless chittering of alien throats. On the outer bastions, the Imperial Navy lent what aid it could, lance batteries burning swarms of descending spores into incandescent showers. Orbital defense cannons barked, vaporizing entire pods before they struck the hive. Yet for every dozen destroyed, another 100 pressed through, raining down like locusts upon fields of wheat. The skies themselves were aflame, streaked with trails of fire and blossoming explosions, a canopy of destruction beneath which men and women fought and died without pause. It was in those hours that the first true cracks appeared in the morale of the guard. Entire platoons vanished beneath waves of claws, their bodies shredded and left twitching in alleys that only moments before had been strong points. Commissars executed deserters in the street, their bolt pistols booming over the chaos, but even their iron zeal could not halt the gnawing realization spreading through the ranks. This was not a battle that could be won, only delayed. Delay was their duty, yes, to buy time for evacuation, for prayer, for the Emperor's will to manifest in some miracle. But delay is not victory, and in the eyes of soldiers watching comrades devoured alive, duty felt like damnation. The swarm did not sleep. Through the endless night, it pressed on, burrowing into the hive's foundations, spilling across its upper spires, turning every level into a kill zone of terror. The once proud banners of the Astra Militarum hung in tatters, scorched by bioacid and torn by claw. And yet, amidst the ruin, there remained sparks of defiance. A squad of guardsmen holding a manufactorum gate until the last man, their bodies piled among the corpses of their foes. A priest dragging a heavy stubber into the open and firing until his arms were slick with sweat and his voice broke from screaming hymns. A mother clutching a child in the underhive, shielding it with her own body until she could shield no longer. These moments flickered like candles against a storm, fragile, brief, but achingly human. By dawn, if dawn could still be called such beneath the shrouded skies, the hive was a city of ash and smoke. Spires leaned drunkenly where explosions had gutted their foundations. The rivers ran black with oil and red with blood. And still, more spores fell, more creatures poured from their living vessels. An endless tide of hunger that made a mockery of exhaustion. For the people of Belican, the first day of invasion had ended. But for the Tyranids, the feast had only begun. The hive's outer bastions held longer than anyone expected, but inevitability does not measure time in hours or days. It measures it in lives. By the third rotation of the planet, the defense lines were already fractured, their walls pitted and scarred by endless bioplasma impacts. Turrets that had once swept clean entire swathes of advancing creatures now lay shattered, their barrels melted into slag, their crews devoured in screaming fragments. The defenders had not faltered willingly. Many fought to their last round, hurling grenades into the swarm, even as they were dragged beneath scything limbs. But the tide was unbroken. Every gain won in blood was consumed within minutes. In the command spires above the carnage, officers pored over flickering hololithic maps, their lines glowing bright 1 hour only to blink out the next. Vox links drowned in static. Entire regiments vanished from record, their names left hanging in mid-transmission, their signals swallowed by the silence that pressed upon the warp itself. Arguments broke out among the senior command. Some demanded an organized withdrawal deeper into the hive. Others screamed for an orbital counterstrike with what little Navy presence remained, even at the cost of burning half the city in the process. But all debates were drowned out by the truth that none dared speak aloud. There was no winning. On the ground, the battle was no longer one of open lines, but of corners, stairwells, and shadows. Gaunts skittered through ventilation shafts, bursting into bunkers with shrieking claws. Warriors tore through barricades, scattering guardsmen like chaff. Lictors, unseen until it was too late, carved apart squads in silence, their corpses discovered only when blood began to pool down the steps. Civilians were pressed into militia units, armed with little more than sharpened tools or low-grade las pistols, their deaths buying mere moments at best. Panic became endemic. Rumors raced through the hive faster than any runner could travel, that the swarm could not be killed, that it multiplied from corpses, that the very air was poisoned by its spores. Fear did what the enemy claws could not, breaking cohesion before the front even buckled. Yet still, here and there, defiance burned. A tank company of Lemon Russes fought until their fuel ran dry, each one becoming a static fortress until overrun. In the Hab sectors, gangs that had once warred over scraps turned their weapons against the intruders, their autoguns barking until they too were consumed. A detachment of Skitari, recalled from distant outposts, arrived in a storm of augmetic precision, their galvanic rifles cutting swathes through the first ranks of the swarm. But even they, relentless and unyielding, began to falter as ammunition stocks dwindled and bioacids scoured their ranks. Every act of resistance was a star burning out, brilliant for a moment, then gone forever. The night that followed was worse than any before. Spore chimneys rose from the earth where mycetic pods had landed, belching clouds that choked lungs and turned the air into a living trap. Entire districts vanished beneath fogs that dissolved flesh from bone. Those who breathed too deep died screaming, their throats eaten away. In the upper spires, nobles fled into panic rooms and sealed vaults, believing themselves safe behind adamantium bulkheads. But safety was an illusion. The Tyranids did not need to find them immediately. Time itself was their ally, and when the swarm grew hungry enough, no wall would remain unbroken. At last, the outermost bastion fell, its gates breached by a living battering ram bred for that purpose alone. The explosion of flesh and ichor that marked its death sent shockwaves through the defenders, and within minutes, the swarm flooded the breach. Guardsmen fought hand to hand in the rubble, bayonets clashing against talons, lasguns fired point-blank into slavering Moors. The air was thick with blood and screams, a cacophony that blurred the line between man and monster. Commissars fired their last rounds into their own heads rather than be taken, while priests clutched the aquila to their breasts and prayed even as their bodies were torn apart. By dawn, Bellacane's defenses had shattered. The city was no longer a fortress but a carcass, stripped of its skin, its organs laid bare for the swarm to feast upon. Only scattered pockets of resistance remained, clinging to ruins with the desperation of the damned. Vox broadcasts repeated the same broken message: hold at all costs, buy time, delay the enemy until reinforcements arrive. But there were no reinforcements. Every man, woman, and child within the hive understood that truth, though few dared to give it voice. They were alone, and the swarm would not stop. And so, as the sun's dim glow struggled through the poisoned sky, the survivors of Bellacane looked upon their world and realized that the sky had not merely darkened, it had closed. The stars were gone, hidden behind a veil of alien flesh and shadow. The Emperor's light, distant though it had always been, no longer reached them. What remained was hunger, and hunger does not forgive. The first chapter ends not with triumph or tragedy, but with inevitability. For the fall of the hive was only the beginning. Beyond its ruins, deeper within the planet and across the system itself, the true collapse had only just begun. They told us to fall back, but there was nowhere left to fall. The corridors that once carried shift trains and ration carts had become veins clogged with bodies, and every junction was a tourniquet pulled tight by fear. Officers with hollow eyes tried to force order onto crowds that would no longer obey. People moved with the blind momentum of floodwater, surging toward rumored shelters that no longer existed, toward transit spires already gutted, toward bulkhead doors welded shut by men who prayed. They were sealing out the end of the world, rather than walling it in with them. The Vox barked contradicting commands, each more frantic than the last, a ragged chorus swallowed by the same suffocating static that had haunted us since the shadow first touched the system. I kept my head down and my rifle up and followed the green glowing rune painted on the wall to mark a fallback point, though the paint flaked beneath my fingertips like dead skin, and even that small guidance felt like a lie. In the air hung a taste like old copper and char. It coated the mouth and insisted that we admit what none of us dared to speak. The hive had died. The body just hadn't realized it yet. The regiment that had once guarded the manufactura gates was now a patchwork of survivors. Helmets didn't match flak vests, boots didn't match tread, and the only thing uniform was exhaustion. We met in a transit atrium under a broken lumen globe that swung on its cable like a pendulum, throwing shadows across the faces of men and women who used to know their own names. Commissar Brandt, who had shot 3 deserters the previous night with a hand that never shook, stood on a crate and tried to make his voice reach us. He spoke of duty and of the God Emperor's gaze, of holding the line so that others might live. And though no one believed the last part anymore, we let the words pass over us like a last rites benediction. In that dim light, his bolt pistol looked heavy, as if it too had learned something of despair. The orders were simple: establish a new perimeter across the transit lines, reroute civilians, hold until the Navy cleared the sky enough for landers. Brandt didn't say what we all knew, that the Navy had been reduced to embers struggling for air, that each hour saw another ship fall silent. He didn't have to. We had watched the streaks of burning hulls write elegies across the clouds. The first real measure of our unraveling came not from the enemy, but from within. In the underhive levels we had left behind, gangs that had once been bound by crude honor turned predatory, filling the void where law had snapped. They raided aid stations for stim and water, dragged medical servitors off their rails, ripped Auspex panels from walls to trade for a handful of shots. The Arbites had splintered into scattered precincts and gone to ground. Their vox appeals reached us in truncated bursts that ended mid-word. A magistrate's final broadcast came through on every frequency at once, a short litany promising penalties for looting and sedition, as if fines and hard labor still meant anything in a city being eaten alive. When his voice cut off, a wet sound followed, like a palm slapped into a bucket. After that, our channels were a storm of unmoored voices, pleading, ordering, praying, accusing. I turned my vox bead down until it was barely a whisper against the bone. At our new line, we sandbagged a barricade from crates of machine parts, stamped with the sigil of a manufactorum that had ceased to be. Every box spoke of an order that would never be filled, of some far-off front line that would now go wanting. Every nail we hammered into place felt like we were fastening a coffin lid, and the thud of each strike echoed strangely in the stale air. Civilians trickled toward us in clumps, grey with dust and disbelief, carrying bundles that had seemed essential an hour before and now hung from their hands with the weight of useless hope. A priest with a split lip walked beside them, murmuring catechisms through the blood and refusing bandages. He lifted the aquila when he saw our line and gave us a blessing that trembled in the middle, recovering only at the final word like a man who had stumbled on the stair and pretended it was part of the step. We sent the people toward a vault deeper in the transit arteries, promising that the bulkheads there would seal, that the air scrubbers still spun, that we would hold long enough for them to sleep. Some of us believed it while we said it. I wanted to. What came for us first were not the claws, but the spores, drifting down the atrium like ash shaken from a great unseen cloak. They clung to lashes and hair, sticky as cobwebs, sweetly rotten on the tongue when you breathed through your teeth. Trooper Helm coughed once, twice, and retched thin bile onto his boots. When he raised his head, there were lacework blisters blooming along the edge of his respirator. Medicae sorted him into the line of those who might live and those we could not spare the chems to save. And in that moment our perimeter became a ward full of slow goodbyes. The Auspex techs shouted that bigger impacts were walking toward us, something heavy pounding a rhythm into the deck plating that our bones recognized before instruments did. The lumen globe on its cable traced slow arcs, and in each swing I saw the barricade, then the tunnel mouth, then the faces beside me, as if the light wished to grant each one the dignity of a final portrait. Out of the tunnels came the gaunts, not in the same howling mass we had seen at the outer walls, but in hunting knots that moved as one mind. They poured through the choke points so quickly they looked fluid, a spill of chitin and talon that filled gaps before we could even finish noticing them. We knew the drill. Layered fire, disciplined volleys, no panic. For the first 2 minutes we were a machine fit to be praised in the Munitorum's manuals, lines of red light stitching a net through which few things passed whole. Then a warrior shouldered through, ducking a beam that ought to have cut its skull in half, and when it roared, the smaller bodies surged with it, as if reeled in by a cable. A flamer team washed the tunnel mouth in promethium, and the world became a furnace, the heat searing the hair on our arms, even through flak. Something squealed at the pitch of metal shearing in a press, and for a breath we were certain the line would hold. Then the flames guttered as spores soaked the air with cloying damp. The roar collapsed into smoke, and the forms inside the tunnel kept coming, silhouette after silhouette like bad dreams summoned into daylight. We fell back 10 meters, then 20, then into the atrium itself, where the cracked tiles showed old transit maps in inlaid brass that our boots smeared with ichor. Commissar Brandt stood on the crate and fired until the back of his pistol smoked, each bolt round a punctuation mark he set against the end of the sentence. When Trooper Helm faltered, Brandt's hand went to the holster by reflex, then stopped. He shouted at Helm instead, voice raw, and Helm's shoulders squared a fraction. In that moment I realized the collapse was not a cliff but a slope, greased by 1,000 small mercies that ran out one by one. We lost 2 more meters, and the crate Brandt stood on shattered. He hit the deck and rose without the pistol. It had skittered beneath the bodies. He drew his sword. The blade looked ceremonial, its gilding scratched and spotted with soot, but when he waded into the breach with it and screamed a hymn until his voice cracked, the men and women beside him moved as if their muscles remembered why they were made. Beyond our fight, another unraveling took shape that none of us could see from the atrium floor. In the command spire, what remained of the staff argued over an evacuation plan that assumed the existence of ships that no longer answered, and when a junior officer dared to say it aloud, they demoted him with the flat of a hand across the mouth. The Skitarii cohort marched toward a different objective on orders updated by a data burst, the moment before the channel died. By the time they reached the specified junction, the junction was a smoking hole. In the heavens, the Navy captains debated whether to burn a corridor through Sporefall with their last reserves or save those shots for the thing they believed would descend behind it all, some great shadow on Auspex that neither resolved nor dispersed. The fleet's astropathic choir lay silent in their cradles. No counsel came from beyond the system. There was only us, and the sound of our breath behind our masks, and the charge indicators on our rifles ticking down like abacuses counting lives. When we broke at last, it was not with screams but with a tiredness that reached into the core and unstrung it. The barricade sank under its own wounded weight, and we yielded step by step, carrying those who could be carried, leaving those who could not with a prayer pressed into their palms. The priest's voice followed us into the deeper tunnels, fraying on the edges as if distance were chewing it. The lumen globe swung once more and went dark, and the atrium's outlines dissolved. We moved by touch and by the glow of a single hand lamp that painted our faces in a small radius of surrender. A child's sob rose and fell, and no one shushed it. The vox crackled and spoke a word that could have been hold or home, and then said nothing more. Behind us, where we had stood, the tunnel sang with chitin on stone. The descent was not sudden. It was the slow hollowing of a structure that had already been cracked, a cathedral roof giving way stone by stone until at last the span caved and buried all beneath it. In the days that followed our retreat through the transit arteries, the Hive became less a city and more a grave that had not yet remembered it was supposed to be still. Every corridor carried the echo of boots fleeing, of screams swallowed by spore clouds, of the scrape of claws moving closer no matter how far we ran. The air tasted fouler with each hour, heavy with rot, until it seemed even breathing was an act of defiance against the truth that the swarm owned every molecule. Command fractured. Some officers clung to procedure, their data slates filled with requisition orders and deployment charts that no longer connected to anything but blank screens. Others simply disappeared, their insignia stripped from corpses later found in gutter sluices. Commissars grew quieter, their threats of execution less frequent, replaced by eyes that stared longer at the floor before they spoke. When Brandt appeared again, his uniform was stained beyond recognition, and his voice carried the ragged undertone of someone who had stopped sleeping. He no longer spoke of victory, nor even of holding. He spoke of buying time, but never said for what. The word evacuation had already curdled into a joke muttered between the men, because there were no ships left waiting, only falling wrecks raining into the atmosphere like flaming omens. The civilians who survived long enough to reach us were shadows of themselves, their faces grey with exhaustion, their eyes rimmed with the pink bloom of spore burn. Families staggered through the choke points, dragging carts piled with trinkets that meant nothing anymore. Some tried to carry furniture, heirlooms, cages of pets already suffocated. They dropped them one by one along the road until the path behind was littered with abandoned memories. We tried to send them deeper into the Hive, into vaults with bulkheads rated for orbital bombardment, but even those places were no longer sanctuaries. In the silence of the Vox, no confirmation came back that any doors had held. Hope shrank like a candle guttering in poisoned air. The guard fought in pockets now. No single line spanned the Hive. Instead, isolated platoons clung to hab spires or manufactorum sublevels, their fire discipline sharp at first, and then fading as ammunition bins ran dry. Resupply was impossible. Munitorum stations had been among the first targets destroyed when spores tore into the supply quarter. We scavenged what we could half-spent charge packs pulled from the belts of the dead, grenades pried from boxes melted by bioacid. Some troopers turned to looting the corpses of their comrades, their hands shaking as they stripped armor still slick with blood. No one stopped them. Desperation made scavengers of us all. At night, the Hive was no longer ours. Even in the deepest tunnels, the swarm's sounds echoed clicks, chittering, the sickening rasp of carapace sliding against stone. Some swore they could feel the vibrations through the ground, as though the world itself had become a drum beaten by claws. Sleep came in fragments, stolen between alarms. Dreams were worse than waking, filled with skittering shadows and endless hunger. Psychers, those who had not yet clawed their own eyes out under the shadow, began muttering in their sleep, reciting words none of us understood. One woke screaming in the middle of the barracks, his body boiling from within as if invisible fire had set him alight. The smell lingered long after we dragged the ashes away. By the fourth day, the collapse was total. Vox nets across the city went dark. The Navy ceased answering altogether. Officers who had once sworn to die at their posts now slumped against walls, their fingers twitching on empty pistols. The faith preached from the pulpits grew shriller, priests whipping themselves bloody to prove their devotion as their flocks shrank into silence. Even the Arbites had fallen. Those few precincts that remained intact broadcast final declarations of martial law before being swallowed by static and the wet thrum of devourers firing into the dark. We had not surrendered. No one spoke that word. Instead, we endured in fragments, the hive splintering into shards of humanity, clinging to corners where light still flickered. But endurance is not hope. Endurance is waiting for the axe, knowing the blade will not miss. And in those hours, as we crouched in tunnels slick with condensation and spore bloom, the realization spread like an infection. The collapse was not coming. It had already happened. We were only surviving inside its corpse. The first time I heard a commander weep, it was not a sound of grief but of something worse, relief. Colonel Stavros had been the kind of officer who embodied the handbook, a man who polished his Aquila every morning, even as ash fell from the skies, who read from the Tactica Imperialis before every engagement, as if the words alone could stitch torn flesh back together. But when his adjutant told him the Vox had gone utterly dead, that even the emergency channels carried nothing but static, he sank into his chair and laughed through his tears. No orders meant no failure, no witnesses, no ledger where the sum of his dead could be tallied against his command. His shoulders slumped, his medals clinked dully against the chair's arms, and he whispered that now, at last, they could stop pretending. 2 hours later, his pistol barked once in his office, and his body was dragged to the corridor, face still wet with tears. The Aquila on his chest gleamed in the half-light, as bright and useless as a star glimpsed through poisoned clouds. Others unraveled more slowly. Commissar Brandt, who had once shouted litanies until his throat bled, now spoke only in rasping fragments, his voice hoarse from smoke and sleeplessness. He no longer drew his bolt pistol against deserters. Instead, he walked among the ranks at night, whispering prayers as though to himself, touching each shoulder like a priest offering benediction. Men followed him still, not out of fear, but because he seemed less a man than a remnant of something stronger. His eyes were hollow, but in their hollowness was a strange kind of comfort, as if he had already accepted the truth and so could no longer be shaken. I watched him one evening stand before a broken shrine, its statues toppled and headless, and offer up his blade to the air, asking for the Emperor to take it if he wished. No answer came. The blade dropped into the dust, and Brandt picked it up again, carrying it as though the weight alone was the only command left. Among the civilians, faith was thinner still. In one of the vaults, I saw a woman paint the Aquila across her child's face with ash from a burned ration crate. She kissed the mark and told him that the Emperor would recognize him when the time came. Hours later, when the spores breached that vault and bodies were dragged screaming into the dark, I found the child's corpse. The symbol still smudged across his skin, and I wondered if he had recognized him after all. Rumors spread like infection in those vaults. Some whispered that terror itself had turned its gaze away, that the Emperor had grown weary of shielding worlds already doomed. Others said the swarm was his punishment for the pride of mankind, a scouring meant to test what remained. There were darker whispers too, that the swarm was no alien at all, but the reflection of humanity's own hunger, come to devour what it had built. No one silenced such talk. In those hours, words were as free as they were empty. In the streets above, the guard fought on with what little ammunition remained. I saw a squad trapped in an intersection where broken hab blocks leaned over them like ribs in a ruined chest. They fought with bayonets, with entrenching tools, even with their bare fists, until the swarm washed over them. Their cries echoed down the stone corridors like the last hymn of a choir whose cathedral had collapsed. We marked their deaths in silence, because silence was all we had left to give. Each skirmish blurred into the next, a ceaseless repetition of blood, ash, and the slick crunch of claws tearing through armor that had been meant to protect. The enemy did not tire. They did not falter. They came as they always came, inevitable, endless, consuming. The greatest cruelty of the collapse was not the hunger of the swarm, nor the decay of our weapons, but the absence of the wider Imperium. In the earliest days, before the shadow had thickened, we had prayed for reinforcements, a detachment of Adeptus Astartes, a fleet of the Imperial Navy, even a whisper of acknowledgement from Terra itself. We received nothing. Each hour of silence hollowed us further, until hope itself became a liability, a cruel edge that cut deeper than any claw. Men stopped asking if reinforcements were coming. The question became too dangerous to voice, as if even wondering might reveal how far we had already fallen. By the seventh day, Bellicane no longer resembled a hive. It was a corpse being eaten from within, its bones cracked and marrow sucked dry. The manufactura no longer thundered. Their great engines stood cold, their smoke replaced with the sickly haze of spore clouds. The spires were hollowed, their glass shattered, their nobles devoured behind doors they had welded in vain. The underhive was a charnel pit, a labyrinth where every corner hid a chittering shadow. The transit arteries where we had fought became tunnels for the swarm, arteries indeed, but carrying alien blood instead of human breath. And through it all, the collapse of hope was more complete than the collapse of walls. Brant still moved among us, whispering his half-prayers. Men still carried rifles, though most were empty. Civilians still huddled in vaults, though no doors could keep out what hunted them. The hive endured, if only in fragments, but hope, that fragile ember that once lit the galaxy, was gone. What remained was endurance, and endurance was only the long shadow of death. The last semblance of order vanished when the vault doors were breached. We had been told those bulkheads were sanctified by the Mechanicus, sealed with wards and codes that no organic claw could unfasten. Yet one by one, the vox feeds cut out, each vault reporting frantic scratching, then pounding, then the wet tearing of steel peeled back like fruit rind. We no longer knew which vaults still held survivors, which were tombs already filled. The Arbites ceased their patrols, their final edicts echoing pointlessly across dead channels. Even the administratum clerks, who had once insisted on stamping every request and filing every requisition, even as blood pooled on their parchment, vanished into the chaos. The great machine of governance that had once ground forward in endless, merciless rhythm was gone. What remained was only the sound of scuttling in the dark and the whispers of men who could not admit they were already lost. Religion, too, twisted under the weight of despair. The basilicas of the ecclesiarchy had been full to bursting in the early days of invasion, throngs of the desperate crowding to hear sermons promising salvation. But when salvation did not come, the voices from the pulpits grew shriller until they cracked into fanaticism. I saw one priest slit his own palm upon the altar, smearing the aquila with his blood and crying that sacrifice would stay the Xenos tide. His congregation followed, opening their flesh in imitation until the air stank of copper and incense. Hours later, the swarm poured through the basilica windows, and the faithful met them not with weapons but with open arms, chanting hymns as they were torn apart. Whether they believed the emperor would lift them in their dying moment, or whether they had simply given up, I could not tell. Their blood ran across the stone in rivers, staining the aquila they had painted in their own lifeblood until it was indistinguishable from the ichor of the Tyranids. Elsewhere, faith curdled into violence. Sect leaders declared that those who did not pray loudly enough were traitors, saboteurs, heretics. I passed through a transit hub where a mob had strung up a dozen civilians on cables, accusing them of inviting the swarm through their lack of devotion. Their bodies hung swaying, their faces slack, as the mob screamed litanies into the void. No Tyranids came for them. The swarm had no need to. We were destroying ourselves more efficiently than their claws ever could. The guard tried to hold the remnants together, but without command or supply they became more militia than army. Platoons fought for food and water as often as they fought the Xenos. Soldiers deserted into the ruins, some to protect their families, others simply to vanish into the anonymity of the Underhive, where they could die without anyone watching. Commissar Brandt did not execute them. He walked among their abandoned bunks, his lips moving in silent prayer, and when I asked him what he prayed for, he told me it was not victory or survival. He prayed only that the Emperor would not look upon this world and see shame. The air itself turned against us. The spore clouds grew thicker until even respirators struggled to filter them. Every breath was a gamble, every sip of water tasted of mold and ash. Fires burned unchecked in the upper levels, their smoke mingling with the haze until it seemed the hive itself was dissolving into poison. The once proud towers leaned like rotten teeth, their steel skeletons glowing red from inner blazes. In the Underhive, gas ruptures ignited, sending shockwaves through tunnels already cracked by bombardments. The city groaned like a wounded beast, every tremor a reminder that even the ground beneath us was failing. In such a world, hope was not merely absent, it was dangerous. Those who spoke of survival drew suspicion, their optimism mistaken for delusion or heresy. Better to keep silent, to crouch in the dark with one's weapon, and breathe the ash until one could no longer tell whether the air killed or the claws would. The collapse of hope was complete when even the children stopped crying. They moved with the same hollow stares as the adults, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if already watching their own end. The last I saw of organized resistance was in the old transit atrium where Brandt had once stood upon a crate. Now it was filled with the wounded, their moans echoing from the cracked tiles. There were no medici left, only a few troopers with stim injectors and gauze stripped from the dead. Brandt moved among them slowly, his hands trembling as he touched each forehead. He told them the Emperor saw them. He told them they would be remembered. His voice did not rise. He did not shout. It was as though he had forgotten how. When the spores began to fall through the broken dome above, scattering their foul dust across the wounded, Brandt did not move to stop it. He knelt in the center of the atrium, raised his head toward the gray sky, and whispered words too soft to hear. Around him, the dying reached out weak hands, touching the hem of his torn coat. Outside, the swarm gathered, its chittering echoing down the avenues, patient and unhurried. It did not need to rush. It knew the hive was already dead. Thus ended the second chapter of our tale, not with a battle lost, but with the quiet certainty that all battles were already lost. The collapse was not a single event, but a slow suffocation, the extinguishing of one light after another until only darkness remained. And in that darkness, something new stirred the awareness that survival would not be measured in holding lines or vaults, but in the fleeting defiance of those who still dared to fight even knowing there was no hope left. The sound of feeding was worse than the sound of killing. Killing was thunder and scream, the bark of lasguns and the crash of collapsing walls. Feeding was wet, deliberate, obscene. It filled the air of Hive Bellicane like a sickness, a constant chorus of tearing, sucking, chewing, of bones splintering beneath mandibles designed not merely to kill, but to extract every ounce of life. Where once the streets had carried the clamor of manufacturer carts and the ringing of bells that signaled shift changes, now they echoed with the crunch of consumption. The swarm was not content to slay. It harvested. Every corpse was stripped, every fragment broken down, every drop of blood absorbed into the endless tide. I saw it first in the Manufactorum quarter, where spore pods had cracked the rooftops open like eggshells. Gaunts swarmed the assembly lines, their talons cutting through conveyor belts as easily as through flesh. They tore workers into fragments, then dragged the remnants toward the biopits that had begun to swell like ulcers in the center of the plaza. There, the true horror revealed itself. Digestion pools, vast and writhing, into which the creatures dumped whatever they seized. Flesh, bone, steel, even stone, they were all thrown together into the churning acids, their forms bubbling and dissolving until they became nothing but slurry. The swarm consumed everything. Nothing was too small or too unworthy. Even the ash of the manufacturer furnaces was gathered and fed into the pools, as though the world itself were being reduced to paste for the hive fleets beyond the stars. The guard fought there, yes. Chimeras rolled into the plazas, their multi-lasers cutting arcs through the swarm. Heavy weapons teams braced behind the shattered hulls of loading haulers, autocannons hammering until their barrels glowed. For a moment, it looked like a stand valiant, desperate, furious. But the swarm does not fight fair. Biovores squatted on the rooftops, their bloated bodies launching living mines that shrieked as they fell. Each impact scattered spores that clawed into the lungs and sprouted from within. I watched a gunner fire his autocannon until his chest burst open in a bloom of alien vines, his weapon tumbling silent as his body collapsed beside it. When the pools overflowed, new forms rose from them, screeching hybrids of flesh and chitin, born already starving, surging into battle with the stink of acid steaming from their carapaces. The plaza vanished in smoke and ichor. By nightfall, there was no plaza, no manufactorum, no guard, only a slick crater where once a district had stood. Elsewhere, the swarm feasted with no opposition at all. In the hab blocks, spore clouds drifted through broken windows, and families suffocated in their bunks without ever seeing the claws that would claim their remains. The swarm entered after, quietly, dismembering the bodies with mechanical precision, carrying them away piece by piece into the pools that multiplied like wounds across the hive. In the underhive, where light had always been scarce, the Tyranids moved like shadows, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark as they herded whole communities into dead ends and tore them apart in silence. By the time anyone realized an entire sector had gone dark, it was too late. The swarm had already scoured it clean. The ecclesiarchy still held their basilica at the city's heart. Its spires, blackened and cracked, loomed over the surrounding ruins, its bells ringing not to call the faithful, but to warn of each new assault. Within, priests clutched flame-wreathed censers and read scripture to ranks of guardsmen kneeling in prayer before taking their positions on the barricades. It was a vision of faith unbroken, but faith does not halt hunger. When the Tyranids came, they came not in skittering knots, but in a tide led by monstrous carnifexes, their bodies armored like tanks, their charge shattering the basilica's outer walls in a storm of dust and stone. The faithful fought with hymns on their lips, flamers roaring, stubbers rattling. The priests burned themselves alive in the holy oils of their altars, flinging themselves into the beasts as living torches. The bells rang until the tower fell, crashing into the plaza below. And then there was no basilica, only rubble slick with ichor and blood. It became clear to us, hiding in the tunnels beneath, that this was no war of battles. This was a harvest. Each defense was not a victory or defeat, but merely the slowing of a process already ordained. The swarm did not leave ruins as the orcs would, nor monuments as the necrons might. It left nothing. Every block of stone, every drop of water, every body, every breath, claimed, digested, made fuel for the fleets waiting beyond the stars. And in that knowledge lay the true horror, that we were not even enemies. We were resources, fodder, biomass. We were already gone. The city changed its shape beneath us, not because walls fell, though they did, but because new anatomy grew in their place. Capillary towers budded from shattered plazas like obscene growths, pale and pulsing, their skins veined with fluids that glimmered sickly under the dim glow of emergency lumens. They swayed as if listening to a music only they could hear, drawing up slurry from digestion pools through flexible trunks and pumping it toward the sky in steady peristaltic gulps. Each tower was a throat swallowing our world. When the wind shifted, we heard the slow glug of their work, and the sound made even veterans wince, as if the noise reached past the ear and pressed a thumb against the mind. We tried to demolish one, a rough coalition of guardsmen, hive-gangers, and a pair of Skitarii with half their bionics wrapped in rag bands for lack of proper sheathing crept along a maintenance viaduct that overlooked a new-grown tower. The plan was ugly but simple. Crack charges at the base, a promethium wash to sterilize any spawn that burst out, then fall back before the swarm could converge. We rehearsed the steps in whispers, our breath fogging inside our masks, our boots sticking to the resin the Tyranids had extruded across the decking. When we reached the tower's root, we felt its pulse through our souls, a slow heartbeat that seemed almost patient. The Skitarii set the charges with hands that never trembled, their augmetic fingers stitching fuse and primer like a surgeon threading a final suture. The blast tore the base open in a gout of steaming bile. For one hot second, triumph cut the air sharper than shrapnel. Then the tower screamed not with a voice, but with sudden spasms up its length, a convulsion that squeezed a flood of liquefied matter down its gullet and out into the square in a tidal sheet. The promethium took. Blue fire crawled across the spill, popping with fat and bone fragments. Shapes writhed within the flame, larval things half-formed, shriveling as they burned. We had done it. We had hurt the swarm. Then the paving erupted beneath our feet, and a trigon burst upward, its carapace slick with the city's blood, its coils shattering the viaduct as if it were glass. Men fell into the flames. The Skitarii fired point-blank, galvanic bolts stitching the beast's gills, and for a moment its head jerked as if confused by pain. It did not die. None of them did. Not easily. We fled over broken railings as the trigon's tail scythed, and when we looked back from the shelter of a collapsed mag-rail tunnel, the capillary tower had already begun to knit itself closed around the wound, flesh knitting with a speed that mocked the human body's slow refusals. After that, the city belonged not to streets and districts but to circulatory maps drawn by an alien hand. Canals became sump-clotted lanes along which feeder beasts paddled, their mouths filtering the soup for anything edible. Hab corridors sagged under the weight of secretions that hardened overnight into ribbed archways, each curve just a fraction too organic for human comfort. We learned to move by stench as much as sight. Fresh resin meant newly seeded ground that would draw patrols. Sour chemical reek warned of bioacid glands ahead. The sweet, cloying odor of the pools signaled a dead end where the world slumped to be rendered. Even the air carried textures. There were places where breathing felt granular, as if each inhale scraped a layer from the lungs. Medicae masks clogged in hours. We stripped filters from the fallen and prayed to outpace the rate of our own suffocation. The swarm fed with purpose. Gaunts combed rubble with the fastidiousness of servitors, plucking out anything that might dissolve. Rippers swarmed in their wake, blind and joyous, their many mouths doing work that required no mind. Warriors strode above both like shepherds. Sometimes they paused and tilted their heads, as if listening to a question larger than the sky, then gestured and redirected the harvest with a single flick of a scythe. I watched a carnifex uproot a statue of some long-dead planetary governor and carry it to a pool as carefully as a dockman handling a crate, submerging the marble effigy until bubbles stopped and the stone softened and slid apart like tallow. Soon, even monuments lost their weight. The Navy tried one last offering from the heavens. Through the brown haze, we glimpsed lance fire lashing down in pale spears, cutting a swath that turned 3 towers to steam and glass. The instant of clean light was so shocking some of us stumbled as if our eyes had forgotten brightness. Then the sky answered with spores and ichor, the flecks of a dying cruiser painting trails that burned out before they reached the ground. Fragments struck the hive in slow arcs, tearing new wounds in decks we had just learned to trust, and the swarm drank those too. The city devoured its rescuers without malice, merely because that is what it now was, a mouth wearing the memory of a home. We learned to fight inside the living terrain. Doors developed lips that sealed behind us. Corridors flexed. Biomembranes quivered just enough to make footing treacherous when we sprinted. Some troopers began to mark their paths not with paint but with cuts. Flesh healed slower than resin, and the rough scars they left in walls made a mapping language that the swarm ignored as meaningless scratches. We fought to keep a handful of junctions open, not because they led to escape, but because they connected pockets of survivors who traded water, chems, and the stubborn comfort of voices answering back. Those routes had names once: St. Verena's Rise, Founder's Span, the Tertiary Magpier, but we renamed them for what they had become: the Gullet, the Great, the Needle. The names felt truer, and truth, however small, was something we could still hold. One night, a sound like distant thunder rolled through the sublevels, and a stretch of deck plating rose in slow ripples. We pressed against walls slick with condensation and watched a sheet of living film slough from the ceiling, revealing that the hive's bones had been tunneled through with a delicacy almost artistic. Beneath lay a new artery curving away into a darkness rippling faintly, as if wind stirred wheat in a field. But there was no wind here, only breath and the restless little movements that living things make when they dream. We heard a vibration, then a low, continuous hum that set teeth against teeth. Someone whispered that the world itself was purring as it fed. No one laughed. The idea seemed too clean to be wrong. By the close of that cycle, our map was a palimpsest of lines crossed out and drawn again, routes tried and lost, promises erased by a tide that corrected our errors in flesh. We slept in shifts behind doors, we jammed with steel we could no longer name, clutching rifles gone smooth with handling, listening for the next tremor that meant the ground was about to learn a new trick. Above us, the capillary towers drank. In our dreams we could feel the pull upward, always upward toward the waiting mouths among the stars. The rivers turned first. Bellicane had once relied on those arteries to ferry Prometheum barges and waste haulers through the hive's underbelly. Now the water ran black and viscous, its currents clogged with carcasses and the pulped slurry of digestion pools leaking downstream. Ripper swarms thrived there, clotted knots of teeth and sinew roiling in the muck, gnawing everything that touched the surface. Those few who tried to escape by raft or makeshift boats were dragged under in seconds, their screams bubbling up only long enough to be muffled by feeding frenzies. The rivers had always smelled foul, but now they reeked of chemical rot, a stench so thick it clung to skin like oil. Soldiers posted along the banks gagged behind their masks, some vomiting into their filters until they choked. The Tyranids had turned lifeblood into poison, every channel of the city re-engineered to serve their hunger. The streets themselves followed. Resin spread in veins across paving stones, hardening overnight into ridges that buckled roads into unnatural slopes. Vehicles became useless, their wheels locked, their tracks jammed. Chimeras and Lehman Russes were left stranded in place, quickly overwhelmed by the tide. Those hulks that survived even a few hours were colonized, gaunts nesting in their hulls, rippers chewing into their engines, feeder tendrils anchoring into every vent. More than once we saw an abandoned tank move again, its turret jerking not under human hands, but under the twitch of alien growth fused into its frame. The swarm made tools of everything we left behind. The air became a weapon last. Spores multiplied until visibility dropped to a few meters in every direction. The haze glowed faintly with bioluminescent particles, turning the hive into a nightmare, lit as if by false starlight. Men coughed themselves raw, their throats bleeding, their lungs riddled with fungal threads that no Medicae could cut free. Mask filters clogged in minutes. Those who stripped them off in panic found their mouths filled with fibrous growth, their tongues swelling until they could no longer scream. We moved through that haze in tight files, each man clutching the back of the one ahead, following touch more than sight, praying that when we emerged from the cloud, it would be into open air and not into the jaws of the swarm. By then, there were no longer battles, only eruptions of slaughter whenever paths crossed. The guard had dwindled into companies barely a dozen strong. Vox relays were nothing but static. No maps mattered. The city itself shifted too quickly to be charted, its avenues bending, its ceilings dripping resin that reshaped every corridor. Civilians huddled in chambers no larger than storage cells, their numbers thinning with each new patrol of rippers that found them. In one vault we discovered 100 survivors crammed together, their bodies slick with condensation and their eyes wide with hunger. They had no food left, no water save what they licked from the resin-coated walls, no prayers save the mutterings of a priest too hoarse to finish a psalm. We gave them what little we had: 3 ration bars, half a canteen of stale water, and we left, because staying would have doomed us all. Their eyes followed us into the dark, and I have never forgotten their silence. The swarm fed without pause. Entire hab blocks collapsed inward as digestion pools bloated beneath them, swallowing towers into slurries that hissed and bubbled. The echoes of human life, the banners, the statues, the manufactura engines, the voices were drowned beneath that endless feasting. It was not war, it was erasure. The orcs would have left ruins littered with the echoes of their violence. Chaos would have left twisted parodies of what had been. But the Tyranids left nothing. They did not even leave corpses to be mourned. Everything, stone, steel, flesh, faith, was broken down into fuel, consumed by a hunger that did not acknowledge us as anything more than calories. And yet, amid this abyss, we clung still to fragments of defiance. A squad detonated themselves beneath a digestion pool, their melter charges boiling it dry before the swarm refilled it. A priest smuggled an aquila, carved from bone, into a spore chimney and shattered it at its core, collapsing the structure in a pillar of blue fire. Small victories, yes. Pointless in the long scale of the war, perhaps, but to us they were everything. Proof that the swarm could be wounded, even if only for moments, proof that we were not yet reduced to silence. Every act of resistance was swallowed in the end. But for an instant, for a heartbeat in the Emperor's gaze, we were more than fuel. By then, we knew the truth. Belakane was no longer a hive city. It was a meal, and meals have courses. The first had been slaughter. The second was feeding. The third, the one that loomed before us, would be digestion complete, the stripping of the very world into fuel for ships waiting beyond the stars. We had no illusions left. We would not see victory. The only question that remained was how long we could burn before the shadows closed over us entirely. The hive was no longer ours. That truth had long since settled, but by the 10th day it became something more visceral, undeniable. The city itself breathed. Floors pulsed faintly beneath our boots, as if the stone had been hollowed out and filled with muscle. Walls sweated with resin that dripped in thick beads, trailing threads of fluid that tasted sour when they fell into open mouths. Air ducts once filled with the hiss of ventilators now whispered with the constant rasp of feeder organisms slithering through their new nests. The city's skeleton had been devoured, and in its place was grown something alien, a construct that bore the memory of Belakane's shape, but none of its soul. We walked inside a corpse animated by hunger, and we knew it. The guard had become prey. Squads no longer patrolled openly. We slunk like scavengers through maintenance shafts and collapsed tunnels, moving only when the swarm's attention shifted elsewhere. Even then, their awareness was never absent. Warriors tilted their heads in unison at sounds we could not hear. Gaunts scurried with purpose, as though guided by thought not their own. Lictors hunted with silent precision, their presence betrayed only by the sudden cessation of footsteps beside you, a trooper here one moment and gone the next. We learned to walk with backs pressed together, every eye scanning the shadows. It made no difference. They came regardless, inevitable as gravity, and when they did, we bled another piece of ourselves into the endless feast. The digestion pools had grown monstrous. Entire districts had collapsed into cauldrons of boiling slurry, the surface crawling with feeder tendrils that sucked greedily at whatever floated within. Chimeras, promethium haulers, even habspires toppled whole into those pits, their outlines bubbling away into nothing. Overhead, capillary towers thickened into trunks, pumping the liquefied remains upward toward orbit. From the streets, we could see their tips vanishing into the poisoned clouds, a reminder that every death below was already nourishing the fleets above. Some troopers swore they heard voices carried up with the flow, screams, prayers, laughter, though whether this was truth or the madness of exhaustion, none could say. The air was filled with new sounds now. The city no longer roared with guns or crumbled beneath bombardments. It gurgled, it hissed, it clicked with the synchronized chittering of countless jaws. At night, the digestion pits glowed faintly from within, casting the ruins in a sickly phosphorescence. It was light without warmth, beauty without mercy. In that radiance, I saw men break. A sergeant I had followed for weeks walked to the edge of a pool, dropped his lasgun, and stepped forward as though surrendering to baptism. The acid swallowed him in seconds, his body dissolving into the slurry without a ripple. We pulled back, unable to stop him, unwilling to watch. The pool did not care. The swarm did not care. He had become part of the feast. And yet, resistance lingered still. A cluster of Skitarii, their augmetics corroded but their minds unwavering, launched a raid against one of the capillary towers. They carried no illusions of survival. Their galvanic rifles cracked like thunder, their voices chanting in Binharic hymns as they charged. They detonated themselves at the tower's base, tearing a wound so wide that for half an hour the tower slumped and shuddered, its fluids spilling across the plaza in a flood that hissed against the rubble. The swarm howled in response, converging by the thousands to knit the damage shut. By dawn, the tower pulsed again, as though nothing had happened. The Skitarii were gone, but for that brief window, they had shown us something fragile and vital. The swarm could be hurt, even if it could not be stopped. Still, each act of defiance was swallowed, as all things were. Bellicane shrank day by day, not in size but in spirit. The Vox carried only static now, save for the occasional echo of distorted hymns looping endlessly, broadcast from transmitters the ecclesiarchy had left behind. Civilians no longer ran. They crouched in corners, their eyes vacant, their lips moving silently in prayers they no longer voiced aloud. Children no longer cried. The Hive's last voices were the screams of those taken in the night, and the chittering chorus that never ceased. On the 11th day, we emerged into what had once been the central plaza of Bellicane. It was unrecognizable. The statue of the emperor that had once towered there, arm raised toward the heavens, lay face down, half melted, its aquila wings sagging like broken bones. In its place had risen a capillary tower thicker than any we had seen, its base surrounded by digestion pools that overlapped until the entire plaza was one heaving mass of fluid. From its crown poured a constant stream of slurry that shimmered as it rose, vanishing into the clouds above. I realized then what Bellicane had become, not a city under siege, not even a world at war. It was an organ, a single functioning organ in a body too vast for us to comprehend. And like all organs, its purpose was singular, to feed. We turned away, not out of cowardice but because there was nothing left to fight there. Our weapons meant nothing, our prayers had gone unheard. We were watching the inevitable conclusion of a feast that had been decided long before our world was ever seeded with human life. All that remained was endurance. All that remained was to carry the story forward long enough for someone, somewhere, to hear it, even if the telling was all that survived. Thus ended the Feast of Shadows, not with the silence of a world consumed, but with the realization that the silence itself was the swarm's true victory. For in that silence, memory died. We had thought our horizon ended at Bellicane's broken spires, but horizons are lies the desperate tell themselves. The truth came down from the sky in streaks of burned metal and shattered sigils, fragments of ships that had once kept whole subsectors honest with the promise of steel and oath. The wreckage fell for hours, bright arcs that etched the firmament with epitaphs, and each impact thudded through the hive like a second heartbeat. Only later did we piece together the shape of it from scattered Vox ghosts and the testimony of survivors whose eyes no longer focused on anything near. The war had grown larger while we starved in tunnels. The system itself was breaking. There had been an orbit, once a ring of promise wrapped around a doomed world. Picket craft and orbital platforms attended the void like watchful gargoyles, and the Imperial Navy held station with prows aimed outward, each lance battery a prayer cast in white fire. When the shadow thickened, astropaths fell silent in their cradles, and navigators crouched behind banded eyelids, tracing dead seas with fingers that trembled. The admirals adjusted formations by auspex alone, playing blindfold chess against an ocean. They caught the first brood nests at long range, torching them with lance strikes that carved blinding scars into the night. For a moment the crews cheered, a sound thin with fear but still human. Then the swarm revealed the rest of itself. and the cheering died. They described it later not as a fleet, but as weather, a front rolling in across the stars, each bioship a storm cell bulging with purpose. Dorsal spines flexed to vomit clouds of parasite craft that swarmed like gnats around a summer throat. The Navy answered with macro-cannon broadsides that walked explosions down those living hulls, with torpedoes that burned their names into the void before striking home. Some bioships split, spilling their wet cargo in coils that froze to glittering strands. Others simply soaked the punishment and kept coming, extruding fresh plates as if healing were just another engine to throttle open. The first line of cruisers tried to hold and bled for it. The second line closed ranks and burned their reactors hot enough to singe the decks, venting heat in shivering curtains across space. Every victory was measured in minutes, and minutes do not stack into salvation when the clock does not admit an end. On the comms, we heard bits of it through the static, the clipped diction of a gunnery officer calling ranges, the flat calm of a captain ordering rams as if asking for tea, the high, thin edge in a midshipman's voice when the deck lurched and the ceiling folded. Again and again we caught the same half-finished sentence before the channel went to snow. All hands brace, as if the galaxy itself had decided punctuation was obscene. Once, for a handful of breaths, a choir voice broke through, the timbre of a ship's machine spirit raised in keening lament, as if even steel could know that it would soon be melted into meat. Then that, too, fell away. The system's lesser worlds did not fare better. Agri moons that had fed Bellicane's billions were the first picked clean, their forests shredded and their oceans wrung like cloth over the capillary towers that rooted into their seabeds. Miners on the rock belts sent frantic code bursts, promising ore and service if only the Navy would come. Their hab hulls were cracked open and sifted like flour. A forged satellite still burned over the gas giant, its magi swearing Binharic curses into the void as Skitarii ranks deployed along the docking tines to fire until their racks went dry. We later met a tech priest whose robes smelled of scorched oil, who told us in a voice smooth with augmentation that the forge had sung its last canticle while venting a plume of incandescent metal into the maw of a passing bioship. He called it beautiful. He did not blink while he said it. Rumor, always faster than light, when truth is shackled, ran in the tunnels like a fever. Some said the Lord's Admiral had signaled for exterminatus, that cyclonic torpedoes had been armed and safeties lifted to grant our world a cleaner death. Others swore the codes never returned from beyond the shadow, that the decision lay in a silence no man dared break. I refused to mark either as fact. We heard only fragments, and fragments tell the stories they want to tell. What we did know, with the certainty of those who feel the building tilt beneath their feet, was that the noose had closed around the entire system. Bellicane was not an exception, it was a sample. The last Navy transmission I personally heard came down through the static, like a voice drowned under ice. It spoke a single coordinate string, then the words, "Hold vector," though hold to what no one could say. After that, only the occasional tremor in the ground told us when something above had died. Each shudder dusted us with grit and resin threads, and in the dim we touched the walls and pretended it was the hand of some great guardian turning us away from worse. Pretending kept our fingers from shaking. And still the harvest continued below. Capillary towers on Bellicane thickened as if answering a call, their pulses sinking to a rhythm we could not hear but felt in our teeth. We began to understand that the timing of the feast was not ours. When biomass swelled within the pools, the towers drank harder. When orbital pressure slackened, some victory won at terrible cost. The pulse slowed to a patient sip. Above, fleets burned and died to turn that sip into a trickle. Below, we waited and listened to the counting. I dreamed of terror then, against my will. Not of its gold-lit palaces, which I have never seen, but of a single steady light across a black sea, the Astronomican's rumor that had guided ships to our sky for all my life. In the dream it flickered once, like a candle guttering in a draught, and I woke with my hands already clenched around my rifle, certain that if it went out, we would forget even the names we had been given at birth. I told no one. Dreams are just another way for the shadow to speak, and we had sworn to give it as few voices as possible. So the system died in layers. First the ships that were supposed to save it, then the moons that had fed its heart, then the rock and ice that had girded it like armor, and finally the worlds themselves, each one dragged toward the same conclusion. We stood inside Bellicane and felt the steps pass through us as a great body walks past a bed of ants. We were not crushed yet. We were merely ignored. There is a special kind of terror in that. The moons went first, their deaths seen in the flicker of the clouds above Bellicane. We knew them only as pale discs that had once balanced our tides, their surfaces etched with farms and spires. Now they burned like candles. Through the haze, we caught glimpses of their horizons glowing red as digestion pools spread across their plains, each one a scar visible from orbit. The agri seas boiled, fields of kelp shriveling into smoke, their nutrients drained into the capillary towers sprouting from every shoreline. By the time word reached us, fragmented vox whispers from Navy survivors, the moons were gone. What had fed us for centuries was consumed in hours, and we felt the gnawing in our stomachs as if the swarm had already reached our bellies. Mining stations around the system lasted scarcely longer. They were built for stone and silence, not for war. Their auger signals flickered in and out of the shadow until one by one they fell silent, their hulls cracked like eggshells. Ripper swarms poured through the fractures, feeding on flesh before the stations themselves were dragged into the maw of nearby digestion pools seeded upon the very rock. Whole asteroids melted, their metals carried skyward into the living fleet. The miners had screamed for aid, offering tithes, or even their lives as servants of the Navy, if only they might be spared. The shadow gave no answer but silence. Silence was always the answer. The Forge World satellite was the loudest death. For hours it lit the night, brighter than any sun, as its plasma reactors vented in uncontrolled cascades. The Magi had fought with mechanical precision, their Skitarii lines firing until their augmetics seized from acid exposure. Some spoke of the forge itself singing, a machine spirit wailing as its sacred circuits were stripped and swallowed. When its final explosion painted the sky, those of us who still clung to the ruins of Bellicane fell silent, because even in the abyss there are things too vast for the human tongue. The swarm did not cheer. It simply drank. On Bellicane, the death of the system made itself known through the rhythm of the towers. Each pulse quickened, each swallow more violent, as if the planet itself strained to keep up with the feast. We felt it in our bones, in the tremors that shook the ground as entire districts slumped into new digestion pits. The streets no longer carried even the illusion of stability. You could walk a corridor one day only to find it sagging and pulsing the next, its stones replaced by chitinous plates. The planet was being rewritten, its surface turned into a harvest organ for something greater above. We were still alive only because the swarm had not yet decided to close its hand. Among survivors, madness took root. Some began to worship the swarm itself, convinced it was the Emperor's true form, his hunger unveiled. I saw a group of civilians kneeling before a capillary tower, chanting praises, even as feeder tendrils snared them and dragged them upward, their voices rising in ecstasy until the slurry silenced them. Others clung harder to old faith, flogging themselves bloody in the ruins of basilicas, smearing scripture across their own skin with ash and blood. Faith and heresy had become indistinguishable. In both cases, death was the only answer. The guard remained, but we were no longer soldiers. We were scavengers with uniforms. We prowled the veins of the hive, searching for ammunition among the dead, ration packs among the rubble. Every bullet mattered, not because it would turn the war, but because it bought a few more breaths against the inevitable. Commissar Brandt still walked among us, his coat in tatters, his eyes sunken but unbroken. He no longer spoke of duty. He spoke only of memory, that if we must die as witnesses. The Emperor counts the faithful, he told us. Even if none are left to write the tally, he knows. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe anyone. But belief did not change the horizon. Above, the fleet drank the world. Around us, the city sank into its new anatomy. Beyond, the system burned planet by planet, until nothing remained but the silence of a feast nearly finished. We were no longer part of a war. We were the crumbs of its aftermath. At first, we lied to ourselves. We said the silence from terror was distance, the shadow only a veil. We said reinforcements were gathering beyond the warp's distortion, that fleets and chapters of the Adeptus Astartes waited for the signal to strike. We whispered that exterminatus would come, merciful fire that would burn our world clean and spare us the indignity of being eaten alive. We told one another these things because the alternative was unthinkable, that the Imperium, vast and eternal, had looked upon us and chosen not to see. But lies rot when spoken too often. By the 12th day, even the most devout no longer asked when help would come. They asked instead how much longer we could keep breathing before the air itself turned to acid. I remember one night when we huddled in a collapsed manufactorum hall, the ceiling cracked open to the night. The stars were gone, hidden behind the swarm's canopy. Only the faint, sickly pulses of capillary towers lit the dark. Brandt stood with us, silent, until one of the younger troopers, barely more than a boy, asked him straight, "Commissar, will the Imperium save us?" For a long time Brandt said nothing, his jaw tight, his hand trembling against the hilt of his sword. Then he answered, "The Emperor saves, always, but the Imperium forgets." The boy said nothing more. None of us did. The realization spread like infection. Civilians stopped looking upward when the skies trembled with distant battles. Instead, they lowered their heads, muttering that whatever fire rained down was not meant for them. Soldiers no longer made plans beyond the next hour, the next ration, the next desperate skirmish. We moved like ghosts through the hive's bowels, keeping to shadows not because it mattered, but because habit is hard to break. Every step felt like trespass in a place no longer ours. Whispers grew in the tunnels, passed between survivors with the weight of confession. Some swore that messages had been sent beyond the system, that astropaths had screamed their final words into the warp, only for nothing to return. Others believed no message had ever left, that the shadow itself had smothered every plea before it could take shape. Either way, the result was the same. No answer, no voice, only silence. And in that silence we learned the truth that the Imperium does not save its children. It consumes them as surely as the Tyranids do, only slower, with parchment and neglect instead of claws. There were those who could not bear the truth. Some turned their lasguns inward, their bodies discovered slumped against resin walls, the barrels still warm. Others sought death in fury, charging blindly into digestion pools with grenades primed to detonate. their final screams lost in the bubbling hiss of acid. A few, perhaps the most broken, sought solace in the swarm itself. I once stumbled upon a group kneeling before a spore chimney, arms outstretched, chanting praises to the Great Hunger. They welcomed the feeder tendrils that wrapped them, their hymns rising in pitch until their throats gurgled with acid. For a moment, I envied them. At least they had found certainty. Brandt tried to hold us together, but even he was cracking. His prayers grew shorter, his gaze distant. Once I saw him staring at the ground, his lips moving silently. I leaned closer and realized he was repeating a single word over and over, asterisk, remember, asterisk. When I asked him later what he meant, he answered, "If the Imperium will not remember us, then we must remember ourselves. That is the only defiance left." His words cut deeper than any sermon. They were not hope. They were an epitaph spoken early. By then, the hive was scarcely recognizable. Towers sagged into the pits, their bones stripped, streets flexed and heaved under resin flows. The city's heartbeat throbbed beneath every surface. We survivors moved through its veins like parasites clinging to a dying host, waiting not for rescue, but for the moment the swarm decided to digest the last scraps. We were not soldiers. We were not citizens. We were not even prey. We were echoes, already forgotten by those who should have remembered us. That was the greatest cruelty of all. Not the hunger of the Tyranids, nor the silence of the warp, but the knowledge that our world would be erased and the Imperium would not notice. We were not lost. We were abandoned. The sky burned for 3 days. We did not see the battles that caused it. We only felt the aftermath, the constant rain of wreckage hammering the ground like iron hail. Fragments of void ships gouged canyons through hive districts, their impact turning whole blocks to rubble before the swarm eagerly poured in to harvest the debris. One cruiser's prow embedded itself into the spire above our hiding place, its still glowing lance batteries bent and blackened. For hours afterward, the air crackled with residual energies, arcs of lightning snapping through the rain until they set the resin walls alight. The swarm drank even that fire, chitin slick with rain hissing against the embers as it feasted upon the broken machine. Those who survived the impacts told us fragments of the story. A squadron of destroyers had attempted to ram a bioship the size of a small moon, their reactors overloading as they struck. The beast had ruptured, spilling kilometers of viscera into the void, but its companions had simply consumed the debris. What would have been a victory in any other war was nothing here but another mouthful. The Navy died to feed the enemy it tried to kill. From Bellacane's surface, the swarm's victory was written in rhythm. The capillary towers no longer pulsed unevenly, their beats faltering as fleets fought above. Now they throbbed in unison, a cadence steady and triumphant. Each pulse pulled the world apart grain by grain, feeding its essence into the void. We could feel the rhythm in our teeth, in our bones, in the rattling of cracked ferrocrete. The entire planet had become a heart pumping its own blood into the mouths of the stars. The hives collapsed one by one, not destroyed in battle, but digested. Spires sagged inward, their bones hollowed and softened until they folded like rotten stalks. Streets caved into pits. Vaults once sealed by adamantium doors dissolved into resin chambers, slick with acid. The populace had long since dwindled into remnants, huddled in the dark. Some were taken quickly, their screams swallowed by the swarm. Others starved in silence, their bodies wasting to husks before the feeder tendrils found them. We stopped counting the dead. There were no numbers high enough, no quills left to scratch them into record. The silence of the Imperium was complete by then. No Vox signal, No astropathic whisper, no flame across the heavens to mark us remembered. The Astronomican's glow, the guiding light of all mankind, did not reach us. We prayed, some of us still, though it felt more like speaking into a grave. I tried to recall the words of the catechisms, the comfort once found in them, but they slipped from my tongue as though the swarm itself had consumed them. When faith falters, what remains is only breath. And even that was growing scarce. The final insult was not the swarm's hunger, but its patience. It did not rush to end us. It harvested carefully, methodically, ensuring nothing would be wasted. Whole districts lay untouched for days, only for the swarm to descend suddenly in a tide of claws and tendrils, stripping everything before moving on. It left us alive longer than necessary, not out of mercy, but because it had no reason to hurry. That was worse than slaughter. Slaughter is at least a recognition of the enemy. This was indifference. I remember the last stand of the Basilica of St. Verena. 1,000 civilians had gathered there, led by priests who carried the Aquila high. They sang hymns until their throats bled, their voices echoing against the cracked stone walls. Guardsmen held the doors with bayonets and faith alone, firing until their rifles clicked empty, then fighting hand to hand. The swarm poured in through the shattered stained glass windows, the light of digestion pools outside staining the holy icons with sickly green. One by one, the hymns faltered, the priests dragged into the tide. When the last voice fell silent, the basilica sank into the earth with a groan, its foundation eaten away from beneath. The Aquila tumbled into the slurry, and the swarm did not even pause. By the end of the third burning sky, Bellicane was gone in all but name. Its hives were pits, its rivers black channels of filth, its people reduced to slurry feeding towers that reached into the void. The system was silent. No ships moved, no worlds lived. Only the steady cadence of the feast, the rhythm of consumption. We survivors, scattered and dwindling, understood then that we were not forgotten. We had never been remembered in the first place. And in that silence, in that final void of all things, lay the true death of worlds, not in fire, nor in claw, but in the absence of memory. For what is a world if none recall it? What is a people if none speak their names? Bellicane would be consumed, the system would be stripped, and the Imperium would carry on, never once knowing what had been lost. Thus ended the fourth chapter of our tale, the death of worlds, a death that is not only the flesh but the soul. When the swarm moved on, it did not announce its departure. There was no trumpet of engines, no victory roar. One day the capillary towers pulsed with the sure cadence of a feast, and the next their rhythm thinned, the gulp becoming a sip, the sip a sigh. We felt the change before we understood it, a loosening in the air, a slackening of the pressure in our skulls where the shadow had pressed for so long. The towers did not fall, they withered, their pale skins puckering as if a thirst had outpaced the cup. Digestion pools sank into themselves, their surfaces crusting over like scabs, then cracking to reveal pits of sediment that no longer steamed. We crept from the tunnels like creatures blinking at a false dawn, rifles held to shoulders that had forgotten how to lower. Bellicane after the swarm was not a ruin. Ruins imply memory walls standing as an argument with time, statues headless but still insisting on shape. Bellicane was an outline left by a fire. Spires that had once thrown knife-sharp shadows across the streets were now stumps of glassy slag. Streets had become plains of fused grit, their former angles melted into something too smooth for the eye to trust. The air tasted empty. Not clean, nothing in this part of the galaxy is ever clean but emptied, as if some vast mouth had inhaled and never exhaled. Where the rivers had run, there lay gouges full of powder that shifted in the slightest breeze, whispering as they settled. We listened for the chittering we had come to expect with every breath. We heard only our own. Silence has a texture. In the days of the feast it had been the heavy quilt under which all sound struggled. Now it was thin and brittle, like the skin atop a long-cooled broth. Our boots cracked it with each step. Vox units clicked and found nothing but the soft hiss of absence. We moved in small knots, marking one another's positions not by sound, but by the geometry of shadows and the pale smudges our bodies made against the dead horizon. Brant walked with us, his coat hanging from him like a flag after a storm, its edges stiff with old ichor. He spoke rarely. When he did, it was to name things that no longer existed, as if saying their names aloud could force the world to remember them. "Founder's span," he would murmur, pointing at a featureless sheet of glass. "Saint Verina's rise." His voice made those places real for a breath. Then the breath ended. We searched automatically for survivors. Habit is a mercy. It gives the hands work when the mind wants to sit down and fold. We found bodies, of course, but only a few. The swarm had been thorough. What remained were impressions, a line of tiny scars in a wall where a child had marked height each year with a blade, the ghost of a fresco in a basilica where pigments had fused to stone, leaving a faint echo of an aquila that dissolved if you stared. In the sublevels we found a vault that had held. The door opened with a grating shriek like an old man's cough and revealed a chamber of dust. No footprints marred its floor. A single data slate lay on a plinth. Brant lifted it as if it might cut him and thumbed the rune. The screen came alive in a wash of static. Then a list of names scrolled, each followed by a regiment designation or a trade, each entry ending in a blank where a fate should have been recorded. We stood around the slate while it cycled, and when it reached the end, it started again without prompting, as if even the device refused to let the name stop. Brant's jaw tightened. "Witness," he said, and his voice did not crack. At night, if such a word had meaning under a sky veiled by ash, the ground still spoke, not with the glutton throb of the towers, but with the much softer settling of a world learning its new weight. Plates creaked, distant surfaces slipped and sighed. Once, far out across what had once been the Manufactorum Quarter, a ridge of glass collapsed into a slow avalanche that poured like syrup, and then hardened mid-motion, a frozen wave with a crest so delicate you could cut your palm on it. We slept in shifts, our dreams simple and mercifully dull. Dry mouths, full canteens that would never be found, a corridor the shape of safety that led nowhere in particular. Rumor, which had gone quiet beneath the shadow, found its voice again in the void it left behind. Some said they had felt the Astronomican's touch return for the span of a heartbeat, a pinprick against the closed eyelid of the soul, proof that the Emperor's beacon had not truly abandoned us, but had been masked, and now light again, distant, impossibly small. Others whispered of visions seen in the edge of sleep, a robed figure standing at the lip of a crater, watching without judgment as the wind drove dust in rings at his feet. We did not argue those tales. We kept them where they belonged, as litany, as rumor, as the way human beings shore up the edges of a world with words when stone and steel have failed. None of us claimed certainty. Certainty felt obscene here. On the third day of silence, a signal found us faint, intermittent, a pulse like a dying insect's wing. We tracked it across the slag flats to the bones of a Vox tower that had half melted and then set like a candle. At its base, a repeater the size of a man's forearm blinked in uneven intervals, its casing warped, its antennae bent into a child's drawing of a crown. Brant crouched and turned the dial with 2 fingers blackened by resin scars. The repeater breathed a voice into the air, thin and ragged, recorded before the feast had ended. A woman's cadence, unhurried, as if speaking to someone she loved who had trouble sleeping. She read names, nothing more. She read until her voice frayed into a cough, then sipped. One could hear the swallow and continued. Somewhere in the recording, the sound of claws approached. She did not stop. We listened to her cross the threshold, to the sudden distortion as the device picked up impacts, to a breath sucked in and held and then released, as if placing a fragile thing on a shelf. The reading went on, softer now, until the words dissolved into static. Brant turned the dial back to 0 with a care that felt like reverence. "Witness," he said again, and for the first time since the skies burned, he smiled, a brief, terrible thing full of grief and pride. We argued for the first time in weeks. The question was simple: to leave or to remain. No ships waited. The warp might have cleared enough for a mad translation if we found a hull that could still crack vacuum, fuel that had not been converted to paste. To stay meant telling the story until our throats gave out, scratching it onto glass with knives dulled on our belts, piling stones into shapes that might be seen from orbit by no one at all. To go meant carrying the tale into a galaxy that may not listen. Silence had taught us one lesson above all. Memory is not a natural law. It must be made, kept, bled for. In the end, we chose the only answer the living can choose. We would try to find a ship, not because we believed the Imperium would reward us, nor because salvation waited beyond the system's rim, but because to move is to refuse the stillness the swarm left behind. We scavenged what little we could, charge packs with 2 bars left, canteens that smelled of iron, a tattered banner whose cloth had fused into something like leather, and we set our boots toward the horizon where the void once glittered. Behind us, Bellicane lay like a cast of itself, the negative space of a life. Ahead, the void lay indifferent. Between them, we carried names. The system itself had gone hollow. We felt it in the pull of tides that no longer obeyed the moons because the moons were gone. We felt it in the way the nights stretched without stars, as if the void had swallowed the map of the heavens. We moved across Bellicane's surface, not as citizens of a world, but as trespassers in a graveyard. The swarm had departed, leaving behind a silence more suffocating than its shadow had ever been. At least the swarm's presence was a weight, a certainty. Silence was absence, and absence is a wound that never scabs. We searched still for proof that something remained. It was instinct, more than hope. Our patrols carried us into collapsed manufactura, into glassy ravines where rivers had once flowed, into vaults that had resisted only to be found empty. Sometimes we discovered relics, a picked capture fused into slag, a ration tin unopened, a child's boot lying alone in a corridor where no child would walk again. We gathered these things and laid them in piles, not as offerings, but as testimony. Brant called them our shrines of fragments. He said one day, if anyone ever came, they would see those heaps of ash and glass and know that we had lived. Among ourselves, words grew sparse. Conversation became dangerous. To speak was to risk naming things that no longer existed, and each name was a knife. Yet silence had its own dangers. In the absence of speech, thoughts turned inward, and inward lay despair. We struck a compromise. Each day, one survivor would tell something of the world before. A street they had walked, a festival they had seen, a person they had loved. The words were rough, often broken, sometimes little more than murmurs, but they drew lines across the emptiness, threads of memory stretched thin but unbroken. The boy who had once asked Brant about salvation told us about a bakery where sweetbread was sold on feast days. He wept as he spoke, and yet we listened, and in listening we remembered the shape of bread, even if no one could taste it again. Rumors followed us still, as they always do when truth is scarce. Some swore the swarm had left spores behind, seeds that even now burrowed deeper into the planet's crust, waiting for a signal to rise again. Others whispered of hidden enclaves that had survived untouched, guarded by the Emperor's own hand, their people waiting to emerge and rebuild. Brant allowed the rumors, but never encouraged them. "Faith is not the same as delusion," he said once. "Faith accepts the dark and walks through it. Delusion closes its eyes and waits for the dark to pass." No one argued, though many closed their eyes anyway. We began to notice something strange in the silence. Without the press of the shadow, dreams changed. They became clearer, sharper, no longer blurred by the hive's oppressive presence. Some dreamt of the Astronomicon, its light flickering faintly across the void. Others dreamt of voices, human voices calling from beyond the system, though no vox confirmed it. I myself dreamt of terror, though I have never seen it. A throne, distant and veiled, upon which sat not a man but a shadow, vast and unmoving, its hands folded upon its knees. It did not speak, it only watched. I woke with my throat raw from screaming, though no one said they had heard a sound. The planet itself continued to settle into death. Capillary towers collapsed inward, their husks hardening into ridges that ringed the horizon like the bones of titans. Digestion pits cooled into plains of glass, vast and smooth, reflecting what little light pierced the clouds. We crossed one such plain, walking for hours without landmark, our boots crunching only faintly on the crystalline crust. In its center lay a single figure, a guardsman turned to a brittle statue, preserved in resin mid-stride, his weapon still clutched in hands that would never release. We stood around him in silence until Brant saluted. None of us followed the gesture, not because it lacked meaning, but because the meaning was too much to bear. At night, when the winds howled through the hollowed hive spires, it sounded like voices. We would jolt awake, and thinking someone had returned, only to find the sound was only air moving through bones of buildings. Some said it was the planet remembering itself, groaning as it realized it was empty. I could not tell if that was truth or madness, but I know this: the silence was never total. It carried echoes, and echoes mean something once was. It was Brant who spoke the thought aloud, one evening as we huddled around a lamp guttering low. "The swarm consumes flesh, but memory," he said, "memory consumes silence." He looked at each of us in turn. "That is our work now." We did not answer, but none of us looked away. We set out for the starport, knowing it could not still exist. The swarm had crashed into it first, vomiting spores across the landing fields, tearing apart the hangars where shuttles once stood. But hope is a stubborn thing, even when it shrinks to a sliver. We marched anyway, through the slagged ruins, carrying what scraps of food and ammunition remained. Each of us knew this was not a journey of rescue, but of witness, that if we found a vessel with even a spark of life left in its reactor, we could try to carve our story into the void. If not, then at least we would die walking toward the stars instead of cowering beneath them. The road, there was no road at all. Resin had melted the ferrocrete into lumps of bone-white glass, jagged and slick underfoot. The air tasted of copper and old rain. Along the way we found relics of flight. The twisted wing of a Valkyrie, a cockpit canopy cracked open like an egg, a pile of lasguns stacked neatly against a wall, as if the soldiers who carried them had simply set them down and walked into the dark. We touched each thing, not as scavengers but as mourners. Brant whispered the same word each time: witness. When we reached the starport, we thought at first it was gone entirely. Nothing rose above the horizon, no towers, no hangars, only a shallow basin filled with hardened resin, smooth as a frozen sea. Then we saw them, hulls protruding from the crust like half-buried bones. The swarm had not eaten everything. Some ships had been left behind, too broken to rise, too empty to feed the fleet. They jutted at angles, their prows torn, their engines fused into slag. But they were ships, and ships meant the possibility, however faint, of flight. We approached the nearest, a bulk freighter, once painted in the yellow and black stripes of a Munitorum supply line. Its nameplate had melted unreadable, its vox array sagged like a snapped antennae of some deep-sea creature. We climbed its flank on resin ridges that gripped like knotted rope and forced our way through a hatch fused shut by heat. Inside, silence greeted us. The corridors smelled of scorched oil and mold. We moved through the husk, searching for a heartbeat. Deep in its belly, in a chamber lined with cracked cogitators, we found it. A reactor still pulsing, faint but alive, its machine spirit whimpering in low binary. The tech adept who had walked with us since the fall of the Forge satellite fell to his knees before it, pressing his lips to the scorched casing as if kissing a relic. He muttered litanies, coaxing the spirit to wake. Lights flickered, then dimmed again. The reactor was crippled, but not dead. It might be enough. Hope is cruel when it stirs too strongly. We fought it down, measuring every possibility. Could the engines ignite? Perhaps. Could the warp drives spin? Almost certainly not. But a jump was not what we sought. A signal, even a short one, would be enough, a shard of truth hurled into the void, carrying our names, our witness, our survival. If one soul, one ship, one scribe beyond the shadow heard us, then Bellicane would not vanish into silence. Brant gathered us in the freighter's hollow mess hall. The table was warped into a wave, the benches brittle as bone, but we sat as if we had gathered for rations again. He stood at the head and placed the battered data slate of names upon the table. If this ship speaks, these names will be its voice. If it does not, then we will be their tongues. He looked at each of us, his eyes sunken but alight with the thin fire of purpose. We are not here to live, we are here to be remembered. The adept worked for hours in silence, fingers blackened with oil, cables sparking against the deck. The rest of us waited, listening to the ship groan as if waking from a nightmare. At last, a sound rose, a low, steady thrum, weak but present. The vox array coughed static, then crackled with a tone that was unmistakably human-made. We looked at one another and dared to smile. The adept spoke without lifting his eyes. "We have voice." Brant placed his hand on the slate, his lips moving without sound. Then he said aloud, "We will speak." And so we prepared to tell the void our story, not because we believed the Imperium would answer, but because silence itself was the greater enemy. The swarm had consumed our world, our system, our flesh, but it would not consume our memory. The freighter groaned like an old beast roused from slumber. Its ribs creaked with every pulse of the wounded reactor, its walls weeping condensation from ruptured pipes, but it breathed. That was enough. We gathered in the Vox chamber, a place half collapsed, its ceiling fused into jagged glass that glimmered faintly with the light of dying consoles. The adept had coaxed the Vox array into stuttering life, its dish above the hull groaning as it tilted, seeking the stars. The air was thick with ozone, and each spark carried the tang of risk. One surge too strong, and the ship might burn from the inside out. But still, we had a voice. Brant stood at the console. The battered is greater than he cleared his throat. The swarm has taken our world, our system, our kin. It has silenced us. But silence is not victory. Victory is memory, and memory is ours. He placed the slate on the console. The adept nodded once, and the vox sputtered, its tone steadying into a thin hum. A channel was open. Perhaps it reached only as far as the void between stars. Perhaps it carried to systems beyond. Perhaps no one would ever hear it. But the uncertainty did not matter. The act itself was defiance. Brant began to read. Name by name, voice unwavering. Each guardsman of the regiments lost. Each civilian scribed on the slate. Each priest, each worker, each child who had been given a name at birth and would not be allowed to vanish into silence. The list rolled on, thousands upon thousands, Brant's voice raw and cracking but unbroken. When his throat failed, another took the slate and continued. When that one faltered, another. We passed the slate hand to hand, our voices rising and falling, weaving a tapestry of witness that no hunger could devour. Hours passed, days perhaps, time blurred. The reactor strained, its heartbeat faltering, but the adept nursed it with whispered Binharik hymns. Static howled at the edges of the channel, but through it all, the names carried, flung into the dark like sparks from a dying fire. I do not know if anyone heard us. Perhaps our words fell into nothing. Perhaps they struck a listening ear, a lonely Auspex tech in some forgotten outpost who paused, leaned closer, and whispered, Asterisk Emperor, they lived. Asterisk, perhaps those sparks found fuel and became flame. We will never know, but we spoke, and in speaking, we defied. At last, the slate's names ended. The final entry scrolled past. A child, no regiment, no title, only a name. The boy who read it aloud let the silence linger, his lips trembling. Then he placed the slate down, and for a long while none of us moved. The vox hummed, waiting. Brant placed his hand on the console. His voice was quiet, almost tender. This was Bellicane. This was her people. We lived, we fought, we were consumed, but we were not forgotten. He looked at us, and in his eyes I saw not triumph, not even faith, only resolve. Let this echo carry wherever it may fall. Let silence know it cannot win. The adept lowered his head and whispered a prayer. The reactor sighed, its final pulse fading. The vox array sparked once, a crack like thunder in the chamber, and then the light died. The hum was gone. The ship slumped into silence once more. We sat there, in the dark, listening to the absence. But the silence was changed. It was no longer the silence of defeat, nor the silence left by the swarm's indifference. It was the silence that follows a voice, a silence that waits, holds, remembers. We did not know what came next. Perhaps starvation, perhaps collapse, perhaps even another tide of hunger sweeping back to finish what it had left unfinished. None of it mattered. We had spoken. The swarm could consume flesh. It could consume worlds. But it could not consume the echo we had cast into the void. For as long as one syllable survived carried by the stars, Bellicane lived still. And so ends our witness. Not with hope, not with salvation, but with memory. And memory, in the end, is enough.